Hey friends! Tonight we're stepping back into the narrow, whisper-filled streets of a medieval town. Not to marvel at cathedrals or castles, but to uncover how something as small as a rumor, barely louder than a breath, could quietly destroy a life. In a world without proof, without second chances, a single word could seal your fate. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm deep dives into history shadows, give the video a like and subscribe if it feels right. Drop a comment with your city and the time where you are. I love seeing this quiet community grow. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin tonight's quiet unraveling. The merchant whose rivals whispered he debased his weights. Imagine yourself in the midst of a medieval marketplace just after dawn. The air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, damp wool, and the metallic tang of coin. Stallkeepers call out gently from beneath awnings of rough cloth. Hens cluck in crates, fish lie still on straw, and every transaction, whether for barley, salt, or dye, hinges on trust in something small but essential: the weight on the scale. In this world, precision was power. Before ledgers and printed prices, value was measured by hand, by eye, by carefully forged counterweights. An extra grain of silver here, a trimmed ounce of pepper there. These were not mistakes. They were decisions. And in towns where reputation traveled faster than horse or cart, even the whisper of dishonesty could undo years of careful trade. So begins the story of a merchant, perhaps one like many others. Neither rich nor poor, but stable. His stall stood near the edge of the covered arcade, sheltered from the rain, but close enough to the road that passing carts would sometimes stop for a quick exchange. He dealt in dry goods, spices, salt, fine flour, and sometimes cloth bundles. Nothing flashy, but reliable wares, priced modestly and measured with visible care. His scales were polished, his weights stamped with the seal of the local guild. He took pride in the rhythm of his work. Coin exchanged, weight placed, sack tied, customer nodding in approval. He spoke little, but he was known for consistency. Not beloved, perhaps, but respected. And in the marketplace, that could be enough. But one morning, a different rhythm arrived. It started not with an accusation, but with a pause. A customer hesitated, looked at the scale longer than usual, whispered to a companion, walked away without buying. Nothing was said aloud, but the act was loud enough. A few stalls down, another merchant made an offhand comment. Something about odd measures. Nothing direct. Just a glance. A tone. A suggestion. By noon, the rumors were moving faster than the merchant's hands. He's clipping his weights. That scale's been tampered. My sack of millet felt light last week. No formal complaint had been made. No official stepped forward. But the space around his stall began to widen. Feet passed without stopping. Heads turned slightly as they walked. Silence grew heavy around the produce that used to sell without effort. The merchant, of course, noticed. He checked his scales, held up his weights to the light, recounted each measure with quiet hands. Everything was as it had been. But in matters of rumor, accuracy is rarely a shield. You see, in medieval towns, trust wasn't enforced by law so much as by presence. Reputation was currency. A merchant's honesty wasn't proven by inspections. It was proven by the number of returning customers, the nods from neighbors, the familiarity in a buyer's tone. And once that rhythm broke, restoration became nearly impossible. Within a day, he had fewer customers. Within 3, none. The guild sent an inspector, not to verify the rumor, but to preserve the marketplace's integrity. The scale was seized, the weights taken for testing. Nothing illegal was found, but the damage had already settled into the cobbles beneath his stall. The fine was small, symbolic even, more of a gesture to reassure the public. But it carried weight all the same. The guild recommended he suspend trading until clarity could be restored. No timeline, No path to repair. Just a suggestion, made official by silence. His rivals, who had never spoken ill aloud, simply filled the space he left behind. Their scales gleamed. Their greetings were louder. Their stalls stood crowded once more. He appealed, quietly, respectfully, but reputation, like flower in the wind, does not return once scattered. It clings to corners, mixes with other dust, vanishes slowly but permanently. What makes this story sting, even now, is that we don't know if the merchant was guilty. He may have been honest, or he may have once trimmed a handful of barley on a lean week. The market didn't wait to find out. It didn't need proof, only momentum. This wasn't uncommon. Records from 13th century town charters and merchant guild books show that accusations of false measure were among the most common disputes. Some were real. Merchants had been caught using hollowed weights, oiling scale arms to stick, or slipping in new measures when guild officials weren't looking. But many were never confirmed. They were simply whispered until believed. It was an easy tactic, especially among competitors. A subtle remark could shift traffic from one stall to another. No need for confrontation, just a seed of doubt and the natural erosion of certainty. And it worked, because the market was a fragile organism. Buyers didn't want scandal. They didn't want to weigh their goods twice or haggle over standards. They wanted to trust the act of buying itself. Once that trust cracked, even a little, they moved on. So what became of our merchant? Perhaps he left the market altogether, took his goods to a different town where no one knew his name. Or perhaps he stayed, quietly working odd jobs behind the stalls where once he had sold his own. Occasionally, someone might have recognized him, nodded politely, remembered when his stall had been full. But the weight of silence lingers heavier than any stamped brass. Imagine now that same marketplace, a week later. The sounds have returned. The calls, the clink of coin, the shuffle of feet. Near the edge, a single stall stands empty, its cloth awning sagging slightly, its boards dusted with flour, and next to it, a hook where a scale once hung, bare, forgotten, but not quite gone. Because in places like this, trust is measured more finely than gold. And once it tips, no counterweight can quite make it level again. The weaver accused of stealing a pattern in the night. Imagine yourself walking narrow cobbled streets before sunrise. The town is still sleeping, shutters closed tight against the cold. Chimneys have yet to breathe smoke. And down one of the side alleys, between a dyer's shed and a tannery that always smells faintly of bark and rot, you hear it. The soft clack of a loom through thin walls, the faint beat of pedals rhythmic practiced. This is the weaver's hour. Not noble, not poor, but skilled. Known by name, but never loudly. A man who kept to his work, whose hands spoke more fluently than his mouth. In towns across medieval Europe, men like this formed the lifeblood of cloth production. Quiet figures whose labor clothed cities and powered trade. They wove linen and wool, and, in wealthier places, even silk. Their work was repetitive, but demanding. Every thread mattered. Every pattern, learned by muscle memory, held value. And it was one such pattern, a design of particular delicacy and symmetry, that cost a man everything. No one saw him enter a rival's workshop. No one caught him with stolen cloth. There were no witnesses, no torn garments, no guards summoned in the night. Only a whisper, a single remark, perhaps made by a competitor over ale, or by an apprentice seeking favor. Someone said they had heard footsteps after curfew, that a door latch had shifted, that the next morning, one workshop's new pattern bore uncanny resemblance to another's unfinished work. That was all it took. In a guild town, where trade was controlled and craft was reputation, such a whisper moved faster than fire. Guilds were both protectors and judges. They preserved standards, regulated apprenticeships, and punished infractions, real or suspected, with startling efficiency. And in a trade like weaving, where patterns were currency, the theft of a design was no small thing. It was seen not only as deceit, but as sacrilege, a betrayal of trust among craftsmen who depended on one another to hold the line between mastery and imitation. The accused weaver denied it, of course. He claimed to have spent the night at his loom. As always, his apprentice swore to it. The workshop had been locked. No stolen threads were found, no marks of intrusion, but denials carry little weight when certainty is replaced by rumor. And the guild, wary of appearing weak, acted swiftly. By the end of that day, he was expelled. The announcement was brief. The guild seal affixed. His name struck from the rolls. His tools, carved shuttles, weighted combs, patterned rods, were seized, not as punishment, but as property no longer rightly his. For a weaver, losing one's loom was more than the loss of income. It was the loss of voice, of identity. He did not stay the night. Most say he left before the bells rang for matins. One cart, one sack. No goodbye. Just the quiet of a man retreating down a road that curved gently out of town, past hedgerows still silver with dew. What lingered was not his presence, but the echo of the claim. The whisper that he had crept into a rival's hall, that he had studied by moonlight, traced patterns by candle stub, and fled before first light. The details changed with each telling. Some said he copied an entire warp diagram. Others claimed he had stolen a finished bolt and buried it in the woods. None of it was proven. None of it mattered, because in a community defined by shared skill, trust was the fabric that bound them. And once that thread was pulled, the entire weave unraveled. There are no court records for this event. It was not a matter of law, but of craft. Guilds often kept their own judgments private, etched into internal ledgers, or passed on through oral tradition. But similar cases are scattered throughout trade records. Carpenters accused of measuring another man's joinery. Dyers suspected of mimicking a unique shade. Scribes who penned letters too similar to another's hand. Each time, the result was the same. Exile, not imprisonment. Because the punishment was not meant to wound. It was meant to sever. In the years that followed, some said they saw him again. In another town, under another name. That his patterns grew more complex, that he taught apprentices of his own. Others claimed he died in poverty, that his skills, without the guild's blessing, withered into obscurity. But the truth is not in what became of him. The truth is in what remained behind. The rival workshop never completed the pattern in question. Whether out of guilt or caution, it vanished from the looms. The alley remained quiet. The apprentice who had defended the accused was given to another master, but he never spoke of that week again. And every new journeyman was warned. Never mimic, never pry, never linger too long by another's cloth. The walls of the weaving quarter, once loud with clack and chatter, carried a different sound now. A caution, a coldness, not fear, but vigilance. Because in a world where patterns are power, even a whisper can undo a life. And sometimes, the sharpest shears are not made of iron, but of words. The midwife said to have cursed a newborn with a glance. Imagine yourself on a narrow lane of wattle and daub cottages. Just after the church bell has marked Compline, hearth smoke hangs low, and the only light comes from tallow dips that tremble behind shutter slats. In one humble room, a woman labors, her breath slow, deliberate, guided by the voice of a seasoned midwife named Matilda. The rhythm of their lives that night is ancient. Heat the water, whisper the prayers, press linen to brow. At last, a daughter slips into the midwife's waiting hands. A single cry, small and sharp, then quiet. Matilda checks breath, wipes skin, murmurs words of thanks, and places the child at her mother's breast. Outside, the stars are indifferent. Inside, the family's world has changed. For 3 days the household rests in a hush broken only by the creak of rushes underfoot. Matilda returns each dawn to mind the bindings and stir the broth. Her reputation in the village is firm. 50+ births without a mother lost, a ledger of life written in swaddling cloth and umbilical knots. Yet on the 4th night, the infant wheezes. Her skin pales to ash. Fever beads along the tiny spine. No poultice or prayer eases the rattle in her chest. Children in this age live on a precipice. Half will not see 5 winters. Still, every death feels singular. Too sudden, too unjust. A neighbor visits with a flask of honey wine. And an opinion. She remembers, she says, how Matilda paused that first night. How her face tightened when she saw a certain birthmark on the baby's shoulder. An unlucky sign, some believe. Perhaps the midwife's touch carried more than skill. Perhaps a glance sealed fate. Such words drift like sparks onto dry thatch. By dawn the rumor has shape. By dusk it has teeth. The plague year is only a decade past. Witches were hanged 2 valleys over last spring. Fear needs little tending. Imagine yourself walking that lane on the 7th day. Doors close as you approach. Mothers clutch children nearer. The baker's boy, once fond of Matilda's crust-end treats, will not meet her eye. She stands at her threshold with folded hands, feeling the weight of silence heavier than any accusation. In markets and manorial courts alike, reputation is life. A craftswoman may labor for decades, yet a single tale, half-whispered, can unravel everything. Matilda's cottage is modest. A low roof of oak shingles, herbs hanging thick as tapestries, bundles of linen stacked beside a small iron pot. Each item speaks of diligent care. The sort that saved breech infants and breached reputations for years. But stories of a curse ignore such evidence. They thrive instead on what cannot be proven. No one recalls the dozens of healthy children Matilda welcomed. They recall only a fevered infant and a look that might have meant sorrow or suspicion or nothing at all. The parish priest, pressed by jittery parishioners, visits to investigate. His manner is gentle, yet his questions needle. Did Matilda invoke saints properly? Did she mark the child with holy water? He examines her birthing knife, bone-handled, clean, and her humble prayer book. He finds no heretical symbols, yet uncertainty lingers in the lines of his brow. Faith here is as much social contract as creed. A hint of deviance unsettles the whole street. Meanwhile, the Lord Steward records births for tax rolls. One fewer future tenant weighs lightly on the ledger, but heavily on family fortunes. The household that lost its child will owe fewer obligations in future seasons. Small comfort for grief, but cause for neighbors to mutter about favorable coincidence. The rhythm of their lives often mixes compassion with calculation. Days stretch into weeks. Matilda's door remains shut. No mother calls upon her skill. Another woman, younger and untested, is invited to assist the next confinement. She brings bundles of dried lavender and confidence sharpened by ambition. The village adjusts, as villages do, to new patterns. Yet bread rises less sweetly in ovens where suspicion ferments. Inside her cottage, Matilda keeps busy, airing linens, grinding fennel, reciting psalms until voice grows hoarse. She remembers each delivery, names hours, first cries. She wonders if memory alone can guard her legacy now that living tongues refuse to speak it. At dusk she lights a single rushlight and listens to the hush outside. No footsteps approach. The absence itself is louder than any knock. Elders later claim no formal trial was ever needed. The community sense delivered verdict enough. They recall how the midwife shutters stayed latched even on market days, how weeds overtook her garden path, how children dared one another to run past her gate without flinching. And they recall, too, the strange calm that followed, as though danger had been named and thus defused. Superstition sometimes masquerades as safety. Seasons turn. Harvest songs drift over fields, ignoring the lost cadence of Matilda's guiding voice. A harsh winter claims more infants, but blame scatters, spread thin by distance and time. Yet one memory remains fixed: the glance that cursed a newborn. It becomes a moral tale told by Hoothfire. Trust, but watch the healer's eyes. Facts fade. Only warning survives. Years later, parish records show Matilda's cottage sold for a modest sum to a tanner's widow. The entry lists no forwarding village, no heirs. Her name appears once more in the margin beside an inkblot, then disappears. Children grow merry. Tilled fields that once echoed with her calm instructions, never quite certain whether the story was true or merely necessary. So when you think of medieval peril, do not picture sword blades alone. Picture also a whisper sliding beneath a doorframe, a rumor that moves faster than plague, a glance misread in the half-light of a smoky chamber. In a world where medicine blends with ritual, where faith and fear share the same vial, the most dangerous weapon may be a story that feels true. And perhaps tonight, as you let your mind drift, imagine the quiet figure of a forgotten midwife tidying her herbs against a window no one visits. Still ready, still waiting, her skill intact, her reputation vanished like breath on winter air. The servant accused of poisoning leftover bread. Imagine a kitchen long since quieted for the night. The fire still smolders beneath the ashes, casting soft warmth across the stone floor. A bowl of dried herbs rests untouched beside the hearth. A knife has been cleaned and placed back on its hook. And on the table, under a linen cloth, a small round of coarse bread, unbuttered, unsliced, left over from the evening meal. The manor sleeps. Outside, the courtyard is silent. But inside the chambers above, a murmur stirs. The master of the house is unwell. He had eaten with the others just before dusk. Roast fowl, beans, and the usual barley bread. Not long after retiring, he had complained of chills, a dull pain in the gut, and a heaviness behind the eyes. By midnight, the household was awake. The steward called for herbs. A boy was sent to fetch the local priest, just in case. Nothing would come of it. He recovered by morning, but fear moves faster than fever. And by sunrise, a whisper had taken shape. Someone had poisoned the bread. There was no proof, no confession, no test, only suspicion, and a target. Her name was not preserved in the records. Only the shape of her story. A kitchen servant, perhaps 17, newer than most. Quiet, reliable. Some said too quiet. She never gossiped, never laughed with the other girls by the well, never stole scraps from the larder. And in a household that ran on routine and rhythm, anything too quiet drew notice. It was another servant, older, more seasoned, who first said it aloud. Just a murmur. She handled the bread last. No accusation. Not really. Just enough to turn glances toward the corner where the girl stood. Just enough to begin. In medieval households, accusations did not need the weight of law to carry consequences. Justice moved by proximity. A word spoken in the right ear could unmake a reputation. And in kitchens, where roles were rigid and tempers close to the surface, scapegoats were easily made. There was no formal inquiry. No charges brought. The master, once recovered, did not demand her punishment. But neither did he defend her. The steward, not wanting disruption in the staff, quietly made the decision. She was sent away before the next sunrise. Not with violence, not with chains, but with finality. A wrapped bundle of her possessions, a few coins, and the order not to return. The village never learned the full details. Rumors varied. Some claimed she confessed. Others said she had been caught stirring something strange into a bowl. None of that was written down. What remained was the fact that one servant left and never came back. It was not unusual. In medieval estates, illness was common. Bread could go stale or moldy. Water might be drawn from an unclean bucket. Meat spoiled in cool weather. Not just warm. A dozen things could make a man ill. But when fear entered the room, explanation no longer mattered. Fear, especially among the servant class, did not shout. It whispered. It rearranged behavior. After the incident, bread was cut by different hands. Spoons were tasted more cautiously. The kitchen grew louder, as if trying to fill the silence she had left behind. For many women in service, the line between usefulness and suspicion was thin. A kind gesture misinterpreted. A task performed too quickly. A face too blank. These were not crimes, but they could become causes. In a world where knowledge was unevenly distributed and trust was bound to hierarchy, misunderstanding often moved faster than truth. We like to imagine that justice is tied to evidence, that accusations rise and fall on what can be proved. But in many households, justice was instead a matter of timing, favor, and proximity to power. If she had been known better, if she had served longer or laughed more easily, perhaps someone would have spoken in her defense. But she was quiet, and that silence made her seem unknowable. And so, her absence became her verdict. She was neither punished nor cleared, merely removed. What happened to her after that is unknown. She may have found service in another house. She may have returned to her family, or wandered from place to place, each time trying to outpace the echo of a story she could never quite explain. No court record marks her name. No grave bears her side. But her story lingers in the patterns of household memory. The times when fear changed the rhythm of a kitchen, when a servant left, and the others spoke of her only when the fire burned low. Such moments are rarely preserved in chronicles. And yet, they shape daily life more than wars or royal decrees ever did. This was not a story of guilt or innocence. It was a story of suspicion, and the weight it can carry when no one stands in its way. So now, imagine that kitchen again. The soft hiss of logs, the scent of cooling broth, the bundle left by the door, a loaf of bread still sitting on the table, untouched, uneaten, perfectly ordinary. And the space beside it, where someone once stood, the pilgrim blamed for a sickness no one understood. Imagine a town not unlike many others in late medieval Europe. Walled, modest, and steady. Its streets are narrow, its homes timber-framed and moss-laced. The days unfold with a dependable rhythm. Bells from the parish church marking the hours, carts creaking over cobblestone, and the dull clang of blacksmiths shaping iron at the edge of the market square. Life is routine, even if never easy. It is in this atmosphere of patterned repetition and quiet hardship that something unexpected arrived. Not thunder nor fire, but a man, a lone traveler, sun-browned and road-worn, with a staff in one hand and a satchel across his back. He entered at the south gate just before evening and was seen pausing near the well to drink, asking for directions to the shrine on the hill. He was a pilgrim. That much was clear from his patched cloak and the badge on his shoulder, one of the leaden tokens handed out at distant holy sites. These tokens were meant to prove piety, to signal that the bearer had walked far for their faith. In times past, such a figure would have drawn sympathy or welcome, perhaps even a bowl of stew or a warm spot near a hearth. But on this particular evening, the mood in town was uneasy, and it would not improve. Within a day, the whispers began. Someone in the West Quarter had fallen ill, feverish, sweating, unable to stand. Then another, and another. Their symptoms were vague but frightening. Hot skin, heavy limbs, a dizziness that stole balance even from the strong. It was not the plague, at least not the black swellings and cough that people had come to dread. But it spread, and quickly. When people are afraid, they look for patterns. And when patterns don't exist, they make them. By the third morning, someone noted aloud what others had already been thinking quietly. That the illness seemed to have begun the day the pilgrim arrived. He had spoken to the tanner's son, someone said. He had stood too close to the well. Another swore they'd seen him cough. There was no trial, no question put formally to the priest or bailiff. The idea passed from mouth to mouth like wind through dry reeds, soft but persistent. No one accused him to his face. But when he returned to the market square in search of bread, no one met his eyes. The baker's wife turned her back. Children were called indoors. That night, as the bells of Compline faded into silence, the pilgrim quietly left. No one saw him go. But in the morning, his bed of straw in the guest house was empty. The hay flattened but cold. His footprints in the mud stretched toward the edge of the woods. He had taken only what he carried on his back. No provisions, no coin. Whether he fled for safety or simply to escape the weight of suspicion, no one knew. The sickness, interestingly, did not stop. A few more townsfolk fell ill. Most recovered. A handful did not. And in time, the fever burned itself out, as such things often did. With no clear cause, there could be no solution. And with no solution, attention turned to other matters. The harvest, the repair of the mill wheel, the return of soldiers from a distant skirmish. But the memory lingered. In medieval Europe, the figure of the pilgrim held a strange place in society. On one hand, they were admired. Souls brave enough to travel far for penance or miracle. They walked from shrine to shrine, sleeping rough, surviving on alms. But they also came from elsewhere. And in a world where sickness arrived without warning or explanation, the outsider was easy to blame. Germs and contagion, as we understand them now, were not yet part of medical thought. Illness was explained in terms of imbalance, of humors, of air, of divine displeasure. A miasma could rise from marshes. A sinful presence could sour a household. A wrong glance might carry weight. In that landscape, the arrival of a stranger during a time of fear became too neat a coincidence to ignore. The man's name was never recorded. No chronicle, no parish ledger mentions him, but his presence survives in the shape of the rumor he left behind. A brief, soft wound in the memory of a town that didn't know what had passed through it. You can imagine him, perhaps, walking through the trees before dawn, the forest mist still low, his sandals damp with dew. He has done nothing wrong, but he carries the knowledge that suspicion, once stirred, cannot be undone by words. He leaves quietly, because that is often the only choice given to those who are blamed without proof. And the town, in turn, continues. The sick are buried, the fields are sown, children grow older. But something subtle remains, a wariness. The next pilgrim who arrives is not offered bread, but watched more closely. The next fever, when it comes, will bring not just suffering, but questions. In this way, fear shapes memory, and memory, over time, reshapes truth. The story of the pilgrim is not unique. History is full of such figures. Those whose presence becomes a scapegoat for what can't be explained. And while the buildings may fall, and the names be forgotten, the pattern survives. Not because it was right, but because it was easy. The young scribe accused of forging official documents. Imagine yourself in a small, narrow chamber, tucked within the stone spine of a medieval estate office. The walls are lined with parchment and wax, and the smell is a mix of candle smoke, drying ink, and cold stone. The light from the single high window is faint and filtered, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table. Here, a young scribe bends over his work with steady concentration. His quill scratches softly, dipping into ink made from crushed oak galls and iron salts, the mixture dark and faintly metallic in scent. He copies legal clauses in a practiced hand, with loops that are careful, letters evenly spaced. He is no one important. Not yet. A low-ranking apprentice of the manor steward, perhaps no older than 20. But he is trusted enough to transcribe the deeds, rents, and contracts that pass through the Lord's Hall. Trusted, that is, until one day, a document reappears with a slight change. A name altered, a mark displaced, a clause reshaped ever so slightly. Enough to benefit one party over another. Enough to shift land, or inheritance, or rights to a distant relative. The accusation is quiet at first. A murmured concern. A pause during a routine audit. But the hall where it is brought up is dimly lit. And the voices that speak hold more rank than the scribe ever will. A bailiff frowns. A clerk frowns deeper. Someone says the change must have been made with inside knowledge. Someone else glances toward the desk where the scribe works. No outburst follows. No dramatic confrontation. Instead, the rhythm of the manor continues, but slightly altered. The next morning, the young scribe finds his writing box missing. The door to the records room no longer opens to his key. His master, who once nodded approvingly at neat columns of text, avoids his eyes. That evening, a simple announcement is made. The scribe's services are no longer required. No crime has been proven, but the stain is set. In the medieval world, reputation clung tightly, but once smudged, it rarely washed clean. The scribes of the period lived lives both invisible and essential. Their work shaped law, trade, inheritance, and memory, yet they were rarely remembered themselves. Ink and silence defined their world. A single line altered could mean the difference between loyalty and treason, between legitimacy and loss. Now consider the world beyond that chamber. In towns and hamlets, scribes were often among the few who could read and write. Their skills gave them access, sometimes to courts, sometimes to merchant guilds. But that access also made them suspect. Their tools were subtle. A forged signature could not be proven by fingerprints or forensics. Instead, it came down to reputation, handwriting, or hearsay. And sometimes, that was all it took. In this young man's case, the ink did not match. His accusers quietly admitted that the alteration did not appear to be in his hand. But the doubt remained. The document had passed through his desk. That was enough. He could not prove innocence, only protest it. And in a world where even a whisper could carry the weight of proof, protest mattered little. He left the estate in the early hours. No cart carried his possessions. A small satchel and his walking stick were all he took. The manor steward did not say farewell, nor did the chambermaids or the cooks, who once shared food and laughter in the narrow back halls. Even among those who had no opinion, silence replaced kindness. Fear of association was stronger than memory. Such stories were not uncommon in the Middle Ages. The bureaucratic world was built on trust, but that trust was brittle, without the means to formally investigate or to preserve clear evidence. Suspicion was often enough to unravel a career. For scribes and clerks, whose livelihoods depended on the integrity of their hand, any blot became permanent. The towns he passed through afterward would not offer him work. At the first, he was turned away by a guild notary who remembered hearing something vague. At the second, a merchant suggested he might try his luck elsewhere. Eventually, the scribe stopped asking. He made coin by reading letters aloud at market stalls for those who could not read. He copied verses of scripture for traveling friars, but he no longer wrote deeds or contracts. Some said they saw him years later in a coastal village, where he taught children their letters in exchange for bread. Others claimed he joined a monastery under a different name, where he tended the garden and never touched ink again. His name faded, but the suspicion lingered. This was the quiet danger of medieval literacy. To write was to hold power, but a fragile one. The same skill that opened doors could just as easily close them. sealed shut with doubt. In a world shaped by words, being accused of bending them, even falsely, was enough to sever a man from the very fabric he helped weave. And so, the ink dried. The deed in question, with its alteration, was later lost in a fire. Its contents forgotten, its damage already done. But the story of the scribe remained, told not in ledgers or chronicles, but in the way others looked at his old desk, or hesitated before trusting the next apprentice. A reminder that sometimes, in the shadows of parchment and pen, trust was written in lines no one could read, but everyone remembered. Sleep now, with that thought, that history is shaped not only by kings and battles, but by the quiet hand that held the quill, and by the silence that followed when it let go. The widow said to hide relics beneath her hearth. Imagine yourself walking along a narrow cobbled lane in a small medieval town just after sunrise. The mist is still clinging to the eaves of slate roofs, and chimney smoke rises in thin, uncertain lines into a sky the color of worn linen. You pass the bakery, where the scent of bread filters through a cracked shutter. Chickens cluck somewhere out of sight, and the rhythmic thud of a blacksmith's hammer starts up like a heartbeat. In such a place, where each day began with ritual and repetition, every face was familiar, and every gesture meant something. People lived close to one another. Walls thin, windows small, secrets hard to keep. It was a world where the line between reverence and suspicion was narrow, and sometimes a whisper could redraw it entirely. At the edge of this imagined town lived a widow named Elsbeth. She had once kept a modest but respectable home with her husband, a mason of quiet reputation. When he died, of an illness not uncommon for men who worked stone in damp conditions, Elsbeth remained in the cottage they had shared. Her hearth was large, built for warmth and for work. It was said her husband had shaped its stones by hand. Widows in towns like this were neither fully isolated nor entirely free. They were watched more closely than they were helped. Without a man's protection, their piety and usefulness became the measures by which they were tolerated. Elsbeth kept to herself more as the years passed. She sold herbs in bundles, brewed weak ale in a back room, and was known to barter mending for food. Then, one spring morning, a quiet murmur passed through the market. A reliquary, small, gold-framed, and said to contain a fragment of a saint's bone, had vanished from the chapel near the edge of town. The theft was discovered by a sexton just after lauds. The wooden box that had held it was empty, the cloth inside slightly askew, as though fingers had lingered too long. The priest made no public accusation. There was no grand search, no formal inquiry. But as often happens in small communities, suspicion settled like dust. Not loudly, not all at once, but evenly and everywhere. It was an old woman who first mentioned Elsbeth's name. Not with certainty, only a breath of possibility. "She has the hearth for it," she'd said. "And haven't you heard she was once seen standing alone in the chapel too long after Vespers?" From there, the story grew itself. It did not need roots to hold fast. The relic was never found, and no one ever saw Elsbeth touch it. But it was easy to imagine the poor, aging widow, burdened by dwindling coin and no family, taking something sacred to trade for survival. In a world where faith permeated everything, from planting schedules to the reasons for illness, relics held weight beyond metal and bone. To possess one, even in secret, might be seen as both a blessing and a curse. To take one unlawfully, however, was almost unthinkable. Not merely theft, but spiritual endangerment. As the days passed, Elsbeth's customers became fewer. Her door remained closed more often. Children began to run past her home, rather than pause to beg dried apples or a story. She was not confronted. No guards came. No search of her hearth was made. The suspicion did not rise to the surface, but neither did it recede. The rhythm of her life, already solitary, thinned. She continued to tend her small garden, though fewer herbs were cut. The scent of boiling ale disappeared. The shutters stayed latched long past morning, when the spring market opened in earnest, with booths of linen and beeswax and fish on crushed ice. Elsbeth's stall was empty. By then, so was her cottage. No one saw her leave. Some say she walked out one foggy morning with only a bundle beneath her arm. Others insist she was taken in the night by a traveling merchant or a cousin from another parish. The truth, like the reliquary, was never confirmed. But for many, the story felt resolved. The gap where she had been made room for certainty, and the tale was retold just often enough to harden into lesson. Later, the hearth in her cottage was dismantled by a new tenant. No relic was found beneath it, only ash and stone. But the unease lingered. The new family who moved in replaced the hearth entirely, saying the old one made them cold, no matter how large the fire. In medieval towns, truth rarely carried more weight than belief. A widow who lived quietly, who spoke little and worked late by firelight, became the vessel for fears too delicate to say aloud. Fears of the poor becoming desperate, of the holy being violated, of order fraying at the edges. Elsbeth's story was told to children not with anger, but with caution. "Do not linger too long near the chapel alone," mothers warned, "and keep your hands in view." The tale was not one of evil, but of danger quietly invited in through need, through silence, through proximity to the unseen. It is unlikely she stole anything, but in a world that prized order and certainty, her aloneness was evidence enough. In time, another relic was donated to the chapel, a fingerbone from a different saint, housed in a less ornate case. It was received with prayers, sealed beneath glass, and never again left unattended. And so the town moved on. But every so often, when the wind came from the river and the fog returned, someone might glance at the old path leading past Elsbeth's home and wonder, not loudly, not for long, what truth might have slept beneath that hearth. And what else, still quiet, sleeps beneath others. The baker accused of diluting flour with chalk. Imagine the gentle hum of a town not yet stirred by morning bells, where shutters are still drawn and the only sounds are the coals being stirred in bakery hearths. You are in a modest corner of a medieval market town, cobbled and quiet, where the rhythm of life begins with bread. Before roosters crow and carts creak, there is the baker, his day already half done by the time others rise. In this quiet rhythm, the baker was a man of habit. He rose in darkness, measured flour with practiced hands, and shaped dough by the dim light of a tallow candle. His bread, round and ash-dusted, fed apprentices and merchants, friars and widows. He was neither wealthy nor obscure. Like many tradesmen, he lived on the edge of comfort, dependent on a predictable trade and the trust of his buyers. And in such towns, reputation was the real currency, easier to lose than to earn. This baker had once been favored. His stall stood close to the well, where passers-by might pause, smell the warm crust, and purchase a loaf on impulse. But bread is not simply food in such times. It was politics, it was regulation, and it was always watched. The weight of a loaf was regulated by town law. The purity of ingredients could be investigated, and accusations, especially whispered ones, moved faster than fire through dry straw. It began subtly. A rival baker, whose shop had fallen on quieter times, made a remark while handing over a crust to a customer. "Strange, isn't it?" he said. "How some loaves seem so pale these days, almost as if the flour isn't flour at all." He smiled as he said it, wiping his hands on a flour-stained apron. No names, no proof, just a comment. But in markets, words matter more than stones. One housewife repeated it to another. A friar declined his usual purchase, citing a vow of dietary purity. A merchant asked, offhandedly, whether the flour came from the abbey mill or the cheaper fields beyond. The baker, unaware at first, noticed only that sales were thinner, questioned sharper. Flour, in this time, was a complex matter. It was sifted by hand, carried in rough sacks, weighed on iron scales. Good wheat was precious, sometimes mixed with barley or rye to stretch it further. In lean years, other additions were known: ground acorns, dried peas, even ground bones in the worst cases. But chalk, crushed and white, had become the newest fear. A fine powder easily mistaken for flour, or so it was said. Soon, town inspectors arrived, men with tablets and measures, who asked polite but pointed questions. They examined his scales, sifted his flour bins, and weighed his loaves with practiced eyes. Nothing amiss, they concluded. The flour, while not the whitest, was pure. The bread, dense and honest. Still, they made a note in their ledger. Once suspicion is named, it rarely retreats. The baker's oven burned as it always had, but his loaves cooled unsold. His apprentices lingered idle longer each morning. Even those who still came did so with caution, often asking, "Is this from a new batch?" Or, "Have the inspectors been by today?" Doubt, once cast, hung in the air thicker than smoke. He tried to adapt, lowered his prices, offered an extra roll for loyal customers. He considered taking his flour openly to the public mill to display its contents. But a baker's dignity is measured in quiet consistency, and each new concession made the whispers feel more true. The rival, of course, denied everything. "I never accused him," he would say, hands raised. "Only noted how difficult these times are for us all." His stall gained traffic as the weeks passed. He began offering new loaves, honeyed crusts, onion-studded rolls, subtly signaling quality and trust. By winter, the accused baker's oven went cold. He closed his shutters more often. It wasn't a formal banishment. No law had declared him guilty. But when the scent of your bread no longer brings comfort, and your name no longer brings trust, the work becomes impossible. Now, imagine yourself walking past that old bakery, years later. The wood is gray with age. The sign above the door is missing. Someone else may have taken the space. A cobbler, perhaps, or a seller of wax tapers. But some still remember. Not the man's name, perhaps, but the tale. "The baker who used chalk," they whisper. A cautionary story for apprentices. A reminder that truth is not always required for ruin. This story, though fictional in its specifics, reflects a very real historical dynamic. The tightrope that medieval artisans walked between survival and suspicion. Bakers, in particular, were under constant scrutiny. Bread was a staple, a necessity, and its quality was protected by law in nearly every town and city. Guilds set standards, but also created rivalries. Inspectors could impose fines or publicly shame a baker who underweighed a loaf. Punishments could be symbolic. Parading a guilty baker through the streets with a burnt loaf around his neck, or severe, including banishment. Dilution of flour was a common accusation in times of scarcity. When wheat prices rose due to war or weather, bakers were tempted or pressured to stretch their resources. Yet often, it wasn't malice or deceit, but survival that drove their decisions. And sometimes, as in our story, it wasn't action but accusation that destroyed a life. What remains most striking is how fragile public trust was, and how dependent livelihoods were on the perceptions of others. A merchant could weigh his coins wrong. A tailor could botch a hem. But a baker's error, or even the rumor of one, risked more than loss. It risked hunger, unrest, even riot. In France, in England, in the Low Countries, there are records of bread riots, when prices rose too high or loaves grew too small. In such a world, a whisper of chalk carried weight far heavier than flour. And so the tale drifts into the background of history. A small oven that burned for a time, then cooled forever. A man who worked by night, fed a town by morning, and fell not from failure, but from the weight of a rumor. His story, like many, is unrecorded in ledgers or scrolls, but it lingers in the cautionary tales of tradesmen and in the quiet truth that trust, once lost, is harder to bake anew than any loaf. Now, let the thought fade like the last embers of a banked hearth. You are no longer in the market, nor in the bakery, but drifting gently in the silence of sleep, where even rumors grow quiet and bread is never bitter. The apprentice said to be the bastard of a noble. Imagine a narrow town street where cobblestones were the memory of countless footsteps. The tannery's sour perfume wafts faintly on the breeze, mixing with the sharper tang of iron from the blacksmith's forge. Across the way, behind a modest timber-framed building with soot-darkened eaves, an apprentice rises early, before the market bells toll. His hands are calloused, his tunic modest but clean, and his manner unremarkable, save for a quiet precision that does not match his youth. His name was Alric, and there was little to mark him out at first. He was diligent in the weaver's guild hall, respectful to the journeyman, and silent in the face of insult. That silence, polished and practiced, was what first stirred suspicion. Where other boys grumbled or snapped or laughed too loudly, Alric observed. He listened, he worked, and he said very little. In most towns, a child's background followed them like the hem of a cloak, dragged behind but never far. But in this town, where small stories quickly grew large, Alric's background was suspiciously clean. No mother in the widow's rows had ever claimed him. No foster father boasted of teaching him his letters. It was said he had come from a smaller village upriver, apprenticed directly under guild rule. Legal, but rare. And so the questions began. At first, they came in the form of teasing, the sort of harmless banter that fills long hours of dyeing and carding. A noble's boy, they said with smirks, too fine-featured for a mill hand, too pale for field work. You sure you didn't sleep on silk before this? Someone asked once, after seeing how carefully he folded his cloth. He didn't answer. That silence, again, became its own answer. And soon, the laughter stopped. Whispers replaced it. Whispers about a certain lord who had visited the area some 16 years ago, known for discretion and quick departures. Whispers that Alric bore a faint resemblance to the man's younger portrait in the Guildhall window, just enough to suggest, not enough to confirm. Nothing written, nothing spoken aloud. Only the quiet, sideways looks passed over the loom. In medieval towns, lineage was currency, though not always written in ink. It etched itself into walls, into privileges, and into shame. Guilds, while bastions of skill, were also gatekeepers of respectability. An apprentice's worth was measured not only in his stitches, but in the reputation he carried with him. A bastard, especially one suspected of noble blood, was both a curiosity and a threat. There was always an unease around those who might blur the boundaries. A peasant who dared to speak too well, a girl who read Latin, a boy who was neither fully servant nor fully kin to those in the hall. Alric became one of those unsettling figures, not because of anything he had done, but because he could not, or would not, explain away the gossip. The masters watched. One withdrew an offer to sponsor him for journeyman work. Another stopped him mid-task to demand who had taught him to write in such an elegant hand. He had no answer that satisfied them, and the silence deepened. Imagine him at dusk, hands stained faintly blue from indigo, sweeping the courtyard behind the workshop. The others had gone to the alehouse. His shadow stretches long across the packed dirt, the broom's rhythm steady. Nearby, the head journeyman leans against a post, arms folded. I heard the Count's third son has your same eyes, he says idly. Alric continues sweeping. He does not look up. The journeyman chuckles, not kindly. You think they'll make room for you in their manor. Once they know you exist, still nothing. Only the rasp of straw bristles on earth. Silence, once again, becomes both shield and blade. It kept him safe from accusation, but also safe from belonging. For a year more, he continued his work. He learned quickly. His pattern work improved, but his path upward within the guild slowed to a halt. The rumors had done their quiet work. He had never claimed to be anyone other than Alric, apprentice. But that had become too much and too little. Eventually he left. No dramatic dismissal. No official banishment. Only a slow accumulation of glances, withheld apprenticeships, and closed doors. He packed his tools before dawn and walked out of the town's southern gate with no ceremony. His name uncarved into any bench or guild record. Those who remembered him would say only that he was quiet. Perhaps too quiet. That he never argued. That he never denied the story either. Some said he was ashamed. Others believed he had taken advantage of the rumor, using it to draw sympathy. But those who truly watched, those few, might say that he was not ashamed at all, only tired. In medieval society, the concept of legitimacy was more than moral. It was structural. Inheritance, honor, and access to learning all hinged on the circumstances of one's birth. To be born outside of wedlock to a noble was to be doubly cursed. Too high for common sympathy, too low for elite acceptance. In that gap, many lives quietly folded in on themselves. Some bastards were acknowledged, even raised in privilege. But others, particularly when the noble in question had something to lose, were quietly denied, left to exist as echoes. Their lives became defined by the absence of acknowledgement. Their silence was not always chosen. Sometimes, it was all they were given. What happened to Alric afterward is not known. Perhaps he joined another guild under a new name. Perhaps he found work in a village where no one asked about his penmanship or cheekbones. Or perhaps he eventually did knock on the door of a manor house, letter in hand, asking only for truth. But in the records of that small town, he exists only as a footnote in the memories of other apprentices. A cautionary tale. A boy who might have been someone, had he only belonged more clearly to someone else. In the end, his story is one of the many quiet one's history leaves behind. Not erased, but never written clearly. Like a thread woven into the back of a tapestry. Present, necessary, but never seen. So if you ever find yourself walking past an old guild hall, and you notice a carving rubbed smooth where a name might have been, pause a moment. The hands that carved it may have once belonged to someone like Alric. Someone who was never quite claimed, and never quite forgotten. The alewife accused of bewitching her patrons. Imagine a narrow street in a small English town, its cobbles worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The day is gray, as most were, and the air holds a faint chill even in the summer months. Smoke rises thinly from a dozen hearths, curling past the wooden beams and overhanging eaves. In one corner, just off the main path, stands a low, timber-framed building. Its sign, a faded image of a sheaf of barley, swings quietly in the breeze. Within, the air is thick with the scent of malt, yeast, and the slightly sour tang of ale that has sat in casks for weeks. This is the domain of an alewife, an occupation long held by women in the medieval world, before brewing became a man's trade. Her name, long forgotten by the records, was once spoken daily in the mouths of laborers, travelers, and neighbors. She brewed small ale, low in alcohol, high in nutrition, alongside stronger drink, supplying the town with what was both a staple and a pleasure. Brewing, in her hands, was both craft and routine. She rose before the light to stoke her fire, grind the grain, and begin the long process of boiling, steeping, and fermenting. In a world where water was often unsafe to drink, ale was essential, and her skill was well regarded. But then, as happens too often in history, a small shift unsettled everything. A handful of regulars fell ill. Nothing dramatic. Fever, weakness, a lingering cough, but enough to stir concern. One man insisted it had begun the morning after drinking her ale. Another added he'd noticed a strange bitterness in his last cup. A third said nothing, but stopped coming altogether. Rumors in such towns do not announce themselves, they creep. A passing comment in the market. A whispered worry in church. Someone recalled seeing her mutter to herself while stirring the mash. Someone else noted that her cat, a familiar figure always curled near the hearth, had mismatched eyes. Another remembered that her husband had died young, years ago, and perhaps she had grown strange in her solitude. The term which was rarely shouted outright. It was spoken under breath, wrapped in euphemism. Not right, they'd say. Or, she has a way about her. The idea that a woman alone, managing barrels and boiling wort, could carry power beyond her station was unsettling to some. Even though alewives had long been central to village life, brewing was increasingly shifting to commercial, male-dominated guilds. A woman who persisted in the trade and profited from it might draw envy, or worse. She brewed as she always had, measuring and stirring by instinct more than scale. But the drink went untouched. Neighbors who once sat gladly at her table now turned away. Barrels stayed sealed, and the heat of her hearth waned with each passing day. In time, an official came, not a magistrate, but a churchman. He did not accuse her directly, of course. He spoke gently, asked if she would allow him to bless the premises. A sign, he said, that all was well and without dark influence. She allowed it, but to some, that alone was proof enough that something had been wrong to begin with. She tried to give the ale away. She brought a jug to a festival day and poured it freely, but few accepted. Those who did remarked later that it had a strange aftertaste. Likely imagined, possibly not. No charges were ever brought against her. This was not one of those cases where a woman was taken, tried, and burned. This was something quieter, perhaps more common. A reputation corroded, a livelihood abandoned. No shouts or torches, just silence and distance. Doors not answered when she knocked. A life gently pushed to the edge. By the end of that year, her alehouse was closed. The sign was taken down. No one knew whether she had left or simply stayed inside. Some said she moved to another town. Others claimed they still saw her walking the edge of the woods, gathering herbs. That her cat still prowled the empty path between the abandoned brewhouse and the church. Centuries later, these small stories survive only in fragments. In the margins of manorial records, in the gaps between tax rolls, in the warnings passed down to new brewers who were told, quietly, not to do things her way. No surviving law accused her. No written testimony confirmed the whispers. But the silence that followed her name carried its own kind of permanence. And yet, in examining her life, we learn more than just the dangers of rumor. We see how crucial alewives once were to their communities. Before brewing was industrialized, before women were pushed from the craft by regulation and gendered suspicion, their brewhouses were spaces of labor, of trade, of comfort. They stood at the intersection of domestic skill and public necessity. And yet, as with so many roles held by women in pre-modern economies, their visibility also made them vulnerable. Ale, for all its warmth and familiarity, was not always safe. Contamination was common. Fermentation was inconsistent. A spoiled batch might smell off, taste strange, or make someone ill. Without modern understanding of bacteria or fermentation chemistry, such illnesses could be seen as misfortune or as malice. And so, when something went wrong, when a tongue swelled or a fever took hold, it was easier to blame a person than a process. Especially a woman. Especially one who lived alone. Especially one who knew how to turn grain and water into something potent. Something that changed how a man felt and thought. If you walked past her house now, if it still stood, you would likely notice nothing unusual. A low wall. A stone step worn by boots. perhaps a hearthstone blackened by long-cooled fires. You wouldn't see spells, or curses, or spectral light. Just a trace of a life once lived, one batch at a time, until it no longer could be. History does not always preserve the names of those who mattered quietly. But every cask left unopened, every hearth gone cold, leaves behind a kind of echo. And if you listen, not for drama, not for fire, but for the small shifts that shape a life, you might still hear it. Not a cry, not a curse, just the hush that follows when trust is withdrawn, and no one comes to drink. The carter said to have seen too much in the night. Imagine the road at night. Not the modern road, lit and paved and marked, but an older path, worn into the earth by centuries of hooves and wheels. Imagine that road winding through low hills, damp with mist, flanked by hedgerows and the outlines of slumbering trees. It's nearly midnight. The moon is low. The stars are hidden behind a thick, moving sky. A wooden cart creaks along the path, pulled by a pair of tired horses. Their breath drifts visibly in the cold air. At the reins, a solitary figure, broad-shouldered, hunched against the chill, guides the team with quiet familiarity. He is a carter. His trade is simple. To carry goods between towns, between farm and market, between manors and the people they own. His life is spent mostly in motion. He knows the roads, the stones, the broken bridges, and the shaded inns. And like many in his role, he prefers to travel early or late, when the way is quieter and the toll collectors less alert. But this night's journey ends differently. He arrives long past the hour when the gates of the town should close. Yet someone hears his wagon rattle over the wooden bridge. A steward's boy sees the lantern swinging from the side of the cart and tells someone at the guild hall. By dawn, the carter's arrival has become something more than a late delivery. Whispers bloom. Too quiet for records, but loud enough for suspicion. They say he passed near the old watchtower that no one speaks of after dark. They say he saw lights where no fires should burn. That he stopped on the ridge and looked down into a valley that had once been used for burials. That he heard voices when none should speak. Others say, without proof, that he was seen again before sunrise, knocking at the door of a stranger's home. That the wheels of his cart bore markings not from dirt, but from symbols no farmer would carve. The truth, if it ever existed clearly, is already gone. But the rhythm of life in the town begins to shift. At the tavern where he once traded grain for cider, the barkeep frowns before serving him. A constable looks twice as he passes. The steward, once content to pay him in copper without question, now takes longer to examine the goods he brings. Questions are not asked aloud, but they multiply in glances. The most dangerous whisper arrives 3 days later. Someone claims the carter saw something he should not, and worse, that he told someone else. A merchant mutters that his competitors seem to know too much of his routes. A reeve notes, vaguely, that the taxes from one estate seem curiously anticipated by another. A monk, visiting from a nearby priory, shakes his head and says nothing, but leaves earlier than expected. Then one evening, the town council calls for a quiet inquiry. Not a trial, nothing formal, just a conversation, an appearance, a chance to explain where he had been, what he had seen, and to whom he had spoken. The carter never attends. By the time the summons is delivered, his home is empty. The small cottage near the gate has been swept clean. His cart is gone. The horses, too. The only thing left behind is a set of faint tracks in the dust. The dry print of wheels and hooves heading east, toward no particular destination. This story, like many others of its kind, leaves more questions than answers. But in the medieval world, that uncertainty was enough to rewrite a man's life. To be accused of knowing something forbidden, or worse, of spreading it, was a risk few could survive, especially if they were ordinary. power belonged to those who could speak behind closed doors, who could name secrets without having seen them, and who would never be accused of treachery simply for traveling after dark. The carter had no such protection. His work made him visible but forgettable, useful, but never truly trusted. He came and went, moved goods, heard things, and perhaps, in that liminal role between village and forest, between manor and market, he overheard something that others wished to stay buried. Or perhaps he simply returned too late one night, and a fearful town needed someone to blame. In medieval towns, it didn't take much to be marked. A late arrival, a glance in the wrong direction, a conversation overheard in a language not recognized. Any of these could become a tale. And tales, once told, had lives of their own. The town continued without him. Another carter took his place. The roads remained, and so did the suspicions, quiet but permanent. The watchtower was still avoided, and the burial valley never reclaimed. When children asked why, elders only shook their heads. As for the man himself, no one knows where he went. Some said he crossed the sea. Others claimed he found work in a distant duchy under a new name. A few insisted they saw him again years later, driving a cart for a wandering theater troupe, but they admitted it could have been someone else. The truth did not matter anymore. His role had already been cast, not as a traitor, but as a shadow, a reminder that in a world without proof or forgiveness, being too close to a secret was as dangerous as revealing one. And so the wheel turns, the wagon passes, and another figure disappears into the quiet fog of history. Sleep now, with that gentle thought, that long ago, beneath the weight of stars and suspicion, a man once fled, not from guilt, but from the silence that follows a whisper too loud to unhear. The potter accused of hiding a fugitive in his kiln. Imagine a town where heat meant more than comfort. It meant work, survival, and silence. In a district near the southern edge of the walls, where the wind carried the smell of damp clay and wood smoke, lived a potter named Gervais. His kiln was built low against a rise in the earth, its shape not unlike a small hut made of scorched stone and cracked lime wash. The ground near it was always warm, even in winter, and his home nearby was modest but clean, lined with stacked bowls and vessels waiting for market. Gervais had lived in the town nearly all his life. He was known not for conversation, but for consistency. Each morning before sunrise, he would walk through the market with a creaking cart, his goods wrapped in rough cloth. Unglazed storage jars handled pitchers, baking tiles. Nothing ornate, nothing wasted. He neither married nor kept a dog. His only company was the long heat of his firing days and the silence between orders. People relied on men like him. They did not need to like him. One winter, near the feast of St. Bridget, something shifted. A man fled the town constable's custody. No one knew why, or perhaps they did, but didn't say. His name, like many such names, faded quickly from records and memory. But his absence lingered. The town gates had been closed that week for a nearby disturbance. Roads watched, doors barred, and yet, somehow, he was gone. That same week, Gervais's kiln burned longer than usual. Ordinarily, he fired every 6th day, the flames rising through the chimney in slow, pulsing waves that flickered far into the dark. But this time, they burned through the 7th day. On the 8th, still the fire glowed behind the small iron grate. At first, no one asked. Perhaps he had taken on extra orders. Perhaps the fuel had been damp. But then a tanner's apprentice mentioned, offhandedly, that he had passed the kiln late at night and heard movement. Soft and irregular, not the pop of wood or the shifting of pottery. The apprentice hadn't stopped. He had no proof, but it was enough. Someone else remarked that Gervais had not come to market that week. Another noted that he seemed thinner, that his shutters had remained closed in the daylight, that the small window facing the alley had been stuffed with cloth. No one confronted him directly. No official visited. But the space around him changed. A baker who once bought tiles for his oven began trading with another. A neighbor who once left scraps for Gervais's hens stopped setting them out. Where once there had been nods, there were now glances held just too long. Eyes that followed. Conversations that slowed when he passed. In towns like these, the boundaries of suspicion were not fixed by evidence, but by repetition. The more a story passed from one mouth to another, the more it hardened into truth. Gervais, who had always been quiet, now found his silence interpreted as concealment, his regularity as calculation. The warmth of his kiln, once the sign of an honest trade, now marked him as someone who had offered refuge to someone who did not deserve it. No one searched the kiln. No one looked for ashes or traces. But no one needed to. The suggestion had taken root. In a world where the wrong association could mean fines, arrest, or worse, distance was the safest currency. Doors that once opened with a nod stayed shut. Small tasks that once earned him coin were passed to others. By the next market day, Gervais did not appear. His house remained. His tools still leaned against the wall, but no smoke rose from the kiln. A week later, the mayor's assistant recorded the property as temporarily uninhabited. No one came to claim it. Eventually, the land was given over to another tradesman, who tore down the kiln and built a smithy in its place. They said the heat never quite left the stones beneath. And the fugitive? He was never found. Some said he made it to the coast. Others whispered he had perished in the forest beyond the fields. Still others believed he had indeed huddled inside the kiln, warmed by clay and fire until he could move again. But that belief came with risk, so it was only ever spoken in kitchens late at night or in fields far from the town walls. The truth, like the ash that once covered Gervais's hands, was lost to time, but the pattern remained. In small towns with tightly woven lives, even a single thread out of place could be pulled until the whole was undone. One flicker of suspicion, one misplaced act of mercy, or even the quiet mistake of being noticed at the wrong moment could redraw your place entirely. Gervais never returned. His name, when spoken, was softened by euphemism. The old potter, some called him, the one with the long fire. His story joined the others that warned against interference, even kindness, that reminded people how easily heat, once admired, could burn. And if the tale was retold to children or murmured between merchants in the months that followed, it was not to question what had truly happened. It was to remind them of the price of being drawn into someone else's silence. The child said to be born under an ominous star. Imagine a village where the days unfold slowly, where roosters mark the hours and time is measured in seasons, not minutes. A place where names are known, paths are worn, and silence holds as much meaning as speech. In such places, where life follows the familiar rhythm of planting, harvest, and prayer, anything unfamiliar, anything slightly out of order, can quickly become cause for concern. Or, worse, a sign. The boy was born on a night when clouds parted just long enough for the red moon to show itself. Not many saw it directly. Some were asleep. Others claimed they had looked away just in time. But a few said they had glimpsed it clearly. Round, red, and still. A blood moon, they called it. And though scholars in far-off cities might attribute it to dust and shadow, in the village, it meant something older. Something less easily explained. At the time, the boy's arrival was unremarkable. He was small but healthy, his mother young but strong. The midwife remarked only on how quiet the child was, not crying loudly as most did, but staring instead with wide, searching eyes. It might have passed unnoticed if not for a shepherd, half-drunk and still awake, who pointed to the sky and muttered, "Strange night for a birth. A red moon always wants something in return." From there, it began. Whispers first, quiet remarks near the well, behind closed shutters, under breath in church. Did you hear? That child, yes, the one born under the sign. No one said exactly what the sign meant, only that it was bad. The boy's name was spoken less and less. Instead, they said that one, or the Red Moon Boy. At first, nothing changed. He grew, played, learned to speak. His mother brought him to market and smiled at passers-by. But misfortunes, as they always do, came and went. When a fire caught in the hayloft that spring, someone said they had seen the child near the barn the evening before. When the baker's wife miscarried late in pregnancy, she mentioned how the boy had looked at her belly oddly the week before. The boy, no more than 5, said little. He was quiet by nature, which only deepened the air of mystery around him. One winter, a fever spread, not a plague, but sharp and sudden, sickening half the village and taking 3 old souls who were already near the end. People survived, but fear lingered longer than illness. And someone, perhaps out of grief or superstition, said aloud what others had only thought. Ever since he was born, nothing has been right. No one answered at first, but no one disagreed either. The boy began to feel it, not in words, but in distance. Fewer greetings, fewer invitations to play. Stones that rolled near his feet, but were never thrown. Doors not slammed, just quietly closed when he passed. Even the priest, who should have offered comfort, advised the family to pray more frequently. Just in case, he said, with a kindness that felt like warning. The child, still so young, began to avoid crowds. He took to wandering alone along the edge of the village, walking near the hedgerows or down by the slow stream that cut behind the fields. He did not ask questions. He did not cry. But there was a stillness to him, as if he understood something unspoken. He watched animals closely, listened to the wind in the trees. Sometimes he sang to himself, very softly, as if reminding himself he was still there. The family endured it for years, weathered the looks, the cold silences, the sudden shifts in conversation when they entered a room. But the village is a small world, and when every glance feels weighted, every greeting half-hearted, it becomes a kind of exile even before you leave. So one day, they did. There was no announcement. Just a cart, loaded before dawn, pulled by an aging mule. They left behind little. The house rented, the hearth cold, the well water drawn one final time. No farewell was offered. None was expected. The child rode beside his mother in silence, his small hand resting on her arm. They disappeared over the ridge by mid-morning, into a fog that drifted down the hillside like a curtain closing. Years passed, and the village returned to its rhythm. Other children were born. Other misfortunes came and went, but no one remarked on them the same way. The house remained empty for a time, then was taken by a blacksmith. The story faded, but never quite vanished. On certain nights, when the moon turned red once again, someone would say, "Do you remember? Not the name, perhaps, but the feeling, the unease. The boy born under the wrong sky." This story, like many others in pre-modern Europe, reflects a time when astrology, fate, and suspicion quietly shaped everyday life. In an age without modern medicine or scientific clarity, people sought patterns where none existed. The moon, the stars, the timing of a birth. These were not neutral facts but signs to be read, warnings to be heeded. The belief in ominous births stretches across centuries. Roman writers recorded births under eclipses as cause for worry. Medieval chronicles described storms and celestial events as signs of political upheaval. In villages with no scholars and few books, the night sky became a book of its own, one that could mark a child with misfortune before he ever spoke his first word. In some cultures, blood moons were seen as moments when the barrier between the natural and supernatural thinned. The color red, linked to blood and fire, stirred fear even in peacetime. when combined with a birth, a moment already steeped in risk and wonder, the result could feel heavy with significance. Children believed to be born under bad signs might be treated differently from the start, kept indoors, not baptized immediately, watched for any signs of strangeness. And even the most ordinary quirks, shyness, unusual dreams, a fondness for solitude, could confirm villagers' suspicions. There was no need for evidence, only the weight of attention, bent always in one direction. And yet, these stories also remind us of something enduring: the quiet cruelty of communities bound too tightly by fear. In a world with so many unknowns, scapegoats became a kind of comfort. If misfortune could be blamed on a single child, then perhaps others could sleep more soundly. Perhaps, as the stars will silently overhead and your thoughts drift from one century to the next, let this story settle softly into the quiet. A boy born in stillness, a red moon overhead, a village that could not look away, and the long, slow journey of forgetting that follows once the cart has vanished over the hill. The clerk accused of revealing secrets to rivals. Imagine the quiet hum of parchment being unrolled, wax seals being cracked, and a quill tapping gently against the edge of an inkstone. In a narrow room behind stone walls, a single candle flickers in a metal sconce, casting long shadows across a desk lined with ledgers. This was the clerk's world. Not one of swords or sermons, but one of records, margins, and memory. His name was Tomas, though few said it aloud. He had held his post for nearly a decade, a familiar figure to those who passed through the Lord's keep. He was neither friendly nor aloof, merely consistent. Each morning, his boots sounded evenly on the tiled floor. Each evening, the ledger closed with the same soft thud. His desk was always neat, his ink always fresh. In a medieval household, especially one of minor nobility, the clerk held a curious position. Not quite servant, not quite steward, but essential. He handled correspondence, tracked deliveries, copied contracts, recorded rents and disputes. He knew who owed coin, who borrowed grain, who passed quietly in the night. The clerk knew many things. And so, when a rumor began that someone within the keep had revealed sensitive accounts to a rival estate, attention turned quickly to the man with the key to the archives. No accusation was spoken aloud. Not at first, only a shift in the air when he entered the hall. A conversation that paused a little too suddenly. A steward who forgot to greet him, or perhaps chose not to. And one morning, when Tomas reached for the heavy iron key to the archives, he found the hook empty. No explanation, no formal charge, only a locked door, and an unfamiliar quiet when he turned to ask why. In medieval society, record-keeping was not simply about documentation. It was control. To write something down was to make it known, and to control who could read it was to hold power over who knew what and when. The written word could bind tenants, divide land, declare alliances. And so the men who handled such records were sometimes trusted, sometimes feared, and rarely fully accepted. Clerks like Tomas occupied a liminal space. They were often educated, but not noble. Literate, but not learned in the theological sense. They answered to the Lord, but were not of the court. Their allegiance was assumed, but rarely proven. And should something go wrong, if grain went missing, if taxes came late, if a rival seemed unusually well informed, the clerk was the nearest target. In Tomas's case, no evidence was ever presented. A whisper, perhaps sparked by envy or error, was enough. A single mislaid sheet, or a duplicate entry in the ledger, might have been twisted into suggestion. Or perhaps a rival steward, angling for influence, had found a convenient scapegoat. The truth, if it ever existed in clear form, was never committed to paper. Imagine the corridor outside the records room. Cool stone beneath one's feet. The faint echo of boots far above in the main hall. Tomas stands beside his desk, The wax seal box already removed, his ledger closed, but not by his own hand. A squire appears at the doorway, not meeting his eyes, carrying a bundle of keys tied with red cord. "You're to leave," is all he says. And Tomas does. No farewell, no confrontation, only the quiet understanding that the trust once given to him had been quietly, irrevocably withdrawn. He leaves before the noon bell, his writing tools wrapped in linen, a single satchel slung over his shoulder. No one walks him to the gate. No one stops him at the town's edge. But even years later, if his name is spoken at all, it is only with a glance over the shoulder, only in the lowered voice reserved for those who once knew too much. In some places, clerks returned to favor. In others, they vanished. A few found work in monasteries, where their skills were still needed, but where silence was more rigidly enforced. Some took on false names. Others taught village children their letters for coin. Tomas's path is not recorded. Like many such figures, he disappears from the paper trail the moment his ink dries. But the story remained, not because it was proven, but because it had been whispered. In communities bound by rumor as much as rule, the suggestion of betrayal was more enduring than any verdict. Stories about betrayal served a purpose. They warned others. They reminded people that no one was entirely safe. Not even the quiet man at the back of the hall with perfect penmanship. And yet, imagine the life of a clerk not accused. The daily rhythm of quill against vellum. The smell of heated wax. The long hours spent adjusting sums and transcribing agreements between men who would never read them. The work was meticulous, unglamorous, and absolutely vital. It is easy to forget, in histories of kings and campaigns, how many decisions were shaped not by the battlefield, but by who controlled the ink. One line altered in a contract could move a boundary. One delay in a delivery record could cost a lord his harvest. The medieval world ran not just on blood and oaths, but on paper, ink, and quiet clerks behind stone doors. And so, when trust faltered, even briefly, the consequences could unfold silently, without a trial, without a defense, and without a name ever being cleared. Today, in the corners of some old keeps, stone shelves still hold ledgers from those centuries. If you were to visit and ask to see them, you might notice that some entries end abruptly. Some names are crossed out. Others are simply left incomplete, the quill lifted mid-sentence. Sometimes, it's not what was written that tells the story, but what was left unfinished. Perhaps somewhere in those dusty shelves lies a page in Tomas's hand. Neat, orderly, precise. A final tally. A shipment recorded. A debt marked as paid. And nothing more. The mason said to have weakened a wall for coin. Imagine a morning fog drifting low across the edge of a medieval town. A haze that softens the outlines of stone towers, cottages, and fields beyond. Beneath that quiet mist, a mason rises early. His hands, thick with old calluses and mortar dust, have shaped the very bones of this town. For years, he worked in silence, lifting stones into walls, fitting each with care. His work did not call for praise, but for trust. Walls that held, roofs that stayed aloft, corners that resisted time and weather. In towns like these, masons were not mere laborers. They were craftsmen of precision, builders of thresholds and sanctuaries. They laid foundations for churches, repaired the crumbling faces of keeps, and reinforced the homes of merchants whose fortunes rose with each generation. Their knowledge passed not through books, but through touch. The angle of a chisel, the feel of lime in a mix, the strain of a wall under weight. Their pride lay not in decoration, but in endurance. And yet, endurance is not just a matter of stone. One autumn, a section of the wall near the western edge of town cracked. A jagged line formed along the mortar joints, subtle at first, then more visible with each rain. It wasn't dramatic, No collapse, no injury. But the town's outer defenses mattered deeply. They were the boundary between the familiar and the unknown. When a wall showed weakness, so too did the confidence of those who lived within. Someone, quietly at first, suggested that it had been built improperly, that shortcuts had been taken, that the wrong mix had been used, and then a sharper whisper, that one of the masons, an older man who had overseen that section, had been bribed. A coin pressed into his palm to turn strong into weak. No one knew who had paid or why, but the suggestion was enough. In a world without modern investigations or engineering surveys, truth was a fragile thing. It didn't matter that he had no enemies. It didn't matter that he had worked on dozens of other structures, all still standing. A single rumor, if it resonated, could spread like a crack in plaster. Quiet, persistent, and hard to seal. At first, he laughed it off. Those who knew him, or had worked beside him, said nothing. Not in defense, not in accusation. Silence, perhaps, born of caution, or fatigue. When the town council postponed further commissions, he tried to wait it out. He offered to inspect the wall himself. He pointed out that heavy rain had recently loosened the soil beneath, that a tree's roots had undermined the base, that stone shifts over time, but explanation does little against suspicion. Work offers dwindled. A merchant canceled a new doorway. A church steward said the funds had run out. A younger mason was chosen instead. His apprentices began to drift away, taking offers where they could. One morning, he opened his shed to find his best chisel missing. He did not ask around. In medieval towns, character was currency. Your good name could open gates and close them. And unlike actual coin, once spent, reputation could not easily be reclaimed. There was no formal accusation, no council meeting, no chance to speak in his defense. Just an absence of invitations, of nods in the market of trust. And so, one morning, he packed his tools. The hammer passed down from his master. The level worn smooth by use. A small pouch of nails and pegs. He didn't say farewell. There were no debts to settle, no children to leave behind. Just the quiet sound of boots on early morning stone, and a cart pulled slowly out of town, following the road until it disappeared into the trees. Where he went, no one quite knew. Some said he found work in a coastal village, where seawalls demanded a different sort of knowledge. Others imagined he lived alone, carving grave markers or tending ruins. One boy claimed to have seen him, years later, working on a distant abbey wall. But stories, like stone, shift with time. The wall he was said to have weakened was later repaired, reinforced. Its flaw became just another layer in the town's long record of wear and patching. No one could point to a section and say, "There is where the failure was." Time, rain, and labor smoothed it over. But for all its silence, this story tells us something more enduring than stone. In medieval towns, craftsmanship was only part of survival. Honor was built with hands, but destroyed with words. Guilds offered protection, but only for those securely within them. One crack, whether in a wall or a reputation, was enough to loosen everything built atop it. It is also a reminder that towns were shaped not just by the visible hands of builders, but by the unseen force of rumor. A wall is only as strong as the trust behind it, and trust, once undermined, cannot be rebuilt with mortar alone. If you walk those town walls today, restored, weathered, but still standing, you might pause at a spot where the stones don't quite match. A line of mortar that looks newer, a patch where the lichen doesn't cling as thickly, and perhaps, beneath that repair, lies the echo of a name once spoken with quiet doubt, then forgotten. The mason's life left no monument. No carving bore his initials, but his absence shaped the town as surely as his presence once had. The work he was denied, the structures he never finished, the apprentices who left before learning all he had to teach. These are forms of legacy too. And so, as you settle into sleep, imagine not the clang of tools, but the soft scrape of hands brushing dust from stone. A quiet man walking through mist, a wall behind him, holding, but just barely, the farmer accused of hoarding grain in famine. Imagine a small village where the fields ripple gold in better years, but not this one. The wind passes over dry stalks that never reach their full height, and dust hangs in the furrows where wheat should be. There are no songs from the harvesters, no hum of carts returning heavy from the threshing. The famine has come again, quietly, as it often does. Not in one great wave, but as a creeping absence. The rains failed early. Then came the blight. One season stumbled into the next without recovery. Bread grew thinner. Porridge stretched further. Livestock vanished from the common fields. Not through theft, but through desperation. Even the dogs grew lean. And amid this quiet hunger, the mind turns easily to suspicion. In this village lived a farmer. Not poor, but not wealthy. A man with a good plot. A strong-backed son, and a wife who sold eggs at market. His barn stood close to the road, his fields along the south ridge. He had been steady, reliable, until the hunger began. At first, it was just a question. Why did his hearth still smoke when others ate nothing warm? Why did his ox survive when others had already salted theirs? Then came a murmur, soft as a cough, that perhaps he had hidden grain. Perhaps he had stored sacks in a pit beneath the floorboards. Perhaps he sold quietly to merchants by night. No one had seen him do this, but no one had seen him hungry either. In times of plenty, such a rumor might have faded. But in famine, every mouth tightens around judgment. And so, as easily as mist settles on the hill, the village turned. One morning, a man from the manor came to ask questions. Not with accusation, but with weary formality. A steward's assistant, tasked with tracking stores and losses. The farmer opened his doors. The barn was empty. The bins bare. The loft held only withered straw. No hidden pit was found, though the floor was prodded and corners examined with more thoroughness than courtesy. Still, the steward left unsatisfied. He said no charge would be recorded, but neither would the matter be dismissed. That was all it took. The market stopped accepting his wife's eggs. The blacksmith, once a drinking companion, asked him to pay in advance. Children stopped coming by to beg leftover husks for birds. A dog was found dead behind his fence. No one said why, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. He stopped going to the village, drawing water instead from a stream that barely ran. His family gathered dry herbs from the hedges, not from the green. The fields, already weak, went untended. There was no point. What harvest would be spared if no one would buy it? By the second month of silence, he stopped speaking to anyone. And by the third, he was gone. They left one evening before dusk. The house was closed, not abandoned. The shutters fastened neatly. The hearth swept, but there were no tracks to follow. The wagon left no ruts. No one saw them depart. Only noticed the absence the next morning when the door remained shut through sunrise. Some said he had taken what grain he had and fled to a town that still had a surplus. Others claimed he had joined smugglers on the river route. A few believed he had indeed hidden grain, but not for profit, only to survive, and that when it ran out, he left rather than endure the stares. The truth was never known. What remained was his field. The land he once tilled slowly turned wild. Weeds came first, then brambles. By the next spring, someone from the manor walked its edge, noting that it might be reassigned. But no one rushed to take it. The suspicion had not vanished. It had merely settled into the soil. This was not uncommon. In times of famine, the enemy was not always nature, but neighbor. The pain of hunger bred more than need. It bred doubt. Those who seemed to endure even slightly better were often accused of cruelty, even if they, too, were simply lucky or just more quiet in their suffering. The rules of fairness frayed. Markets once built on trust became battlegrounds of rumor. Even truth did not protect. The farmer had nothing to hide, and still he lost everything. Because famine is not only the absence of food, it is the absence of certainty. And once trust collapses, there are no solid walls left, only the creak of suspicion, and the cold left behind when a door is closed for the last time. The village moved on. The hunger eased, eventually. A new family took a house nearby. A child asked why that field was always left fallow, and the elder only replied, "It belonged to someone who wouldn't share." That, perhaps, was the only legacy. Not what the farmer did or did not do, but what people chose to believe. Sleep now with that quiet truth, that in history, some absences echo longer than presence. And sometimes, it is not what we hoard that shapes our fate, but what others imagine we've hidden. The tanner said to use human remains in his pits. Imagine yourself passing through the narrowest street in a medieval town. Not the market lane with fresh bread and linen, but the one behind the workshops, where the air is thicker and the earth remains dark even at midday. You walk past shutters slick with condensation, where rainwater drips slowly from the edges of sagging thatch. This is the tradesman's quarter. Less polished, less watched. It is here, near the edge of a sluggish creek, that the tanner once worked. The tannery was not a place one chose to linger near. Even by the standards of the time, the smell was difficult. Sharp with lime, rank with flesh scraped from hides, heavy with the scent of soaked bark and brine. But these were the necessary labors of leather. Shoes, belts, scabbards, aprons, all required the uncomfortable magic of making skin endure. The man who ran this tannery was named Matthew. He was not liked, but he was not hated either. Like many in unpleasant trades, he occupied a space just outside the social fabric. People needed his work. They didn't invite him to feast days. He employed 2 apprentices, both young and largely silent. His pits were always full, his tools hung neatly, and his schedule was known. Sunrise to dusk, 6 days a week. For years, this arrangement held. The tannery did its work, the townsfolk kept their distance, and the smell was tolerated the way one tolerates cold wind or muddy roads. Without affection, but without protest. Then came the rumor. It began, as many things did, with a change in the wind. One morning, the scent drifting from the tannery was said to be different. Not merely foul, but wrong. Heavier, more pungent, with an edge that made people pause. A carpenter who lived nearby remarked that it reminded him of the day a pauper's body had been pulled from the river in summer. Another swore that stray dogs had been seen pacing outside the gate more than usual, tails low, heads tilted. No inspection followed. No guard was summoned. But within the week, someone whispered that Matthew's hides might not all come from animals. That he had, perhaps, used something else. A traveler who vanished. A thief no one missed. Or bones from the graveyard during a flood. No one could say precisely where the tale began. But once spoken, it was impossible to unhear. Tanning already skirted the edge of taboo. The process involved lime to loosen hair, urine to soften skin, dung to cure it, and days of soaking in pits that no outsider ever dared inspect too closely. So when the idea took hold, that the tanner's work might have crossed a line no one could name, it spread faster than it could be corrected. Matthew denied nothing. In truth, he was never asked directly. The town simply stopped bringing him hides. Shoemakers found other sources, even if they had to pay more. The blacksmith's apprentice, who once fetched leather strips, began avoiding the lane entirely. The apprentices drifted away, one after another, finding work where the air was clearer. No proof ever surfaced. No pit was emptied. No body was found. And yet the gates to the tannery were bolted shut one morning, and Matthew was gone. No farewell, no note. Just a silence that hung thick over the shuttered windows, and a smell that seemed to linger weeks longer than it should have. Children dared one another to approach the locked yard. Some claimed to hear knocking from inside the vats. Others said Matthew still lived within, working by candlelight, speaking only to ghosts. The town officials made no statement. Perhaps they were relieved not to have to confront the truth, or the lie. In time, the building was left to ruin. Roof tiles slid free in winter, moss crept up the outer wall, and the iron latch rusted shut. No one attempted to reopen it. Even when new families moved to town and space was scarce, the tannery remained untouched. It became one of those places that everyone knew and no one entered. The truth, as often in such stories, matters less than the shape the tale took in people's minds. Matthew may have done nothing wrong, may have been the victim of coincidence, of wind and water and the natural decay of time. But once fear laced itself into the air, once imagination filled the cracks in what little was known, there was no recovering his place in town. This was a common risk in medieval life. To be not merely accused but imagined. To become the subject of stories, especially in trades already mistrusted. The butcher, the grave digger, the midwife, the tanner. Those who dealt in the boundaries of body and earth. Their work was necessary, but it was never entirely clean, and never quite sacred. Matthew's story joined the others that whispered of crossing the line between what was done and what was dared. Whether he used human remains or not, whether he fed the fires of fear knowingly or simply stood too close to suspicion, his gates remained locked, his name remembered only in murmurs. And even now, if you close your eyes and picture that quiet alley, with its slick stones and heavy air, you might imagine the shape of the vats, the hanging hides, the slow drip of water from eaves. And just beneath that, if you listen, the soft shuffle of something buried too deep to name. The candlemaker accused of dimming the church lamps. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow lane just after sunset, in a town where oil is precious and flame is life. The sky has turned from gray to black, and every window that glows offers a small comfort against the creeping dark. In such a place, a single candle means more than light. It is presence, it is protection, and those who make them hold an unspoken power over the rhythm of the evening. The candlemaker's shop stood just off the square, wedged between the cooper and the tinsmith. It was not grand, but it was steady. The walls bore the soft scent of beeswax and animal fat, a smell most would not call pleasant, but all would recognize. It clung to his apron and hands, to the curls of wick, and to the melted drips that cooled in trays. His trade, while humble, was vital. He lit the evenings. He lit the prayers. By day, he cut cords and poured molds. By night, his candles flickered on tables, in kitchens beside children's beds. But it was the church that gave him both pride and standing. Each week, he supplied the sanctuary lamps, those tall, watchful tapers that burned through masses, vigils, and quiet confessions. It was a trust he had earned over years, not given lightly. And for a long while, no one questioned it. Until one evening, when the lamps faltered. It was during Vespers, a cold evening, late autumn, the sort where breath hovered in the air and coats were drawn tighter over shoulders. The congregation had gathered in reverent silence. The priest, robed and solemn, spoke softly under vaulted stone. But the flame, those tall flames that should have stood still in their glass, grew faint. First one, then another, a flicker, a sputter, and then darkness. It was not total, of course. A few candles remained, but the front lamps, the ones meant to shine near the altar, faded far too early. A murmur moved through the pews. The service continued, though thinner now, the shadows longer than they should have been. And after, in the hush of gathering coats and quiet farewells, someone whispered, "Strange, perhaps the tallow wasn't right." A shrug followed. The new batch didn't smell of beeswax. That was all. But like smoke from a snuffed wick, it spread. The next morning, the church steward came, his tone careful but cool. The candles, he said, would no longer be needed. The church had decided to seek a new supplier. No accusations, no questions, just a sudden end to a long-held arrangement. And in small towns, the decisions of the church are seldom private. Word moved quickly. If the candles had failed there, why trust them at home? Why risk a weak flame near a cradle, a hearth a prayer? The candlemaker protested, gently at first. He offered to inspect the wicks, to review the molds. He suggested perhaps the chill in the air had caused the tallow to cool too quickly. But the silence he received in return was not an answer. It was dismissal. No formal charge. No test or tribunal. Just fewer customers each day. Then none at all. His shop remained open for a time. He kept pouring, kept shaping, kept lighting the small flame above the door at night. But it burned only for him. No buyers came. Only glances through the shutters and murmurs in the bakery queue. "You can't even trust the light these days," someone would mutter. In truth, the failure may have been nothing more than a draft through the nave, or an overused wick, or more likely, a trick of timing, unfortunate and unexplained. But explanation matters little once confidence is broken. In a world lit by flame, a failed candle is not just a flaw. It is a betrayal. Eventually, his shop fell dark. The trays grew cold. The wax hardened in forgotten pots. He sold what he could, packed what he could carry, and left without complaint. His name was not cursed, but it was not spoken either. The townspeople merely adjusted, finding new light, forgetting the hands that once shaped their evenings. This story reflects a real fragility that surrounded trades in pre-modern towns, particularly those whose work bordered the sacred. Candlemakers were more than artisans. They were enablers of rituals, maintainers of presence in the dark. And because their work was consumed silently and judged by how long it endured, their reputations depended not on spectacle, but on trust. Tallow, in those days, came from rendered animal fat, cheaper than beeswax, but smoky and prone to impurities. It hardened unevenly. It flickered if cooled too fast. Wicks could be made from twisted flax, or tow, or poorly spun cotton. All of it required precision, and yet even perfection could not protect against suspicion. Inferior candles were feared not just for inconvenience, but for danger. Fires began easily in wood-framed homes, and children read by flame. A dim candle was not just weak. It felt uncanny, like a failing heartbeat. And in churches, where candles represented more than light, where they marked the divine, the eternal, a failed flame could feel like a sign from above. Guilds sometimes regulated candle production, but in many towns, a single craftsman might serve an entire community. That intimacy made their fall more painful. When one tradesman failed, the loss was personal. It meant reassessing every flame lit before, every prayer whispered beside a flicker. In that way, even the smallest failure became communal. And once a town moves on, there is rarely a return. Perhaps the candlemaker lived quietly elsewhere, offering his skill to another parish with no knowledge of the rumor. Or perhaps he abandoned the trade entirely, choosing another rhythm, one less tied to trust and wax. But in the town he left, the memory lingered, not in anger, nor sorrow, but in the simple act of caution. When new candles burned bright and long, someone would say, "These are good ones," with the subtle implication that others had not been. And that would be all. Now, as you rest and let this story settle like wax cooling in a mold, picture a flame, steady, small, warm. The kind that holds its shape in still air. Let it flicker gently behind your eyes. A symbol of trust, and a reminder of how quietly it can be lost. The candlemaker's tale, like the candles he poured, was never meant to last forever. But for a moment it burned, and for a while, it gave light. The gatekeeper said to be a traitor in disguise. Imagine a tall stone gate, weathered by wind and smoke, set into the outer wall of a town that rarely slept soundly. Its wooden doors creaked when opened, iron-bound and heavy, worn smooth where countless hands had pushed them wide. Just beyond the threshold, a man stood each day, wrapped in a woolen cloak, bearing the simple tools of his station. A lantern, a set of keys, and a long memory for names and faces. He was the gatekeeper. Not a soldier exactly, but not a common laborer either. His job was quiet but not simple. To watch, to recognize, and to decide. When to open, when to ask questions, and when to say nothing at all. His name was Dallin, though to most he was simply the keeper. His post was steady, his manner plain. He knew the rhythms of the road. When shepherds brought in flocks, when traders returned from the high roads, when messengers came at strange hours with damp cloaks and quick glances. He recorded their comings in a small book, initials in tidy rows, and always asked where they had traveled and why. And then, one autumn, a rumor crossed the border before any horse did. A traveler arrived mud-caked, out of breath, and claimed that a neighboring province had been breached. Spies, he said, had entered undetected. Gold had changed hands at border gates. Loose tongues had endangered lives. He said this at an bench, after ale and bread. But someone listened, and someone remembered the time Dallin had waved a certain merchant through without pause. And someone else remembered hearing coins jingle before the gate opened early, once before dawn. No accusations were made, only recollections, only nods shared over tankards. The idea, once whispered, became a shape everyone recognized. A traitor, not in armor or cloak, but in plain wool and worn boots. In medieval towns, security was less about walls and more about watchfulness. Borders were porous. Maps were vague. Trust mattered more than ink. A gatekeeper's loyalty was assumed, but also easily doubted. He controlled passage, and therefore, in a quiet way, controlled risk. When fear entered a town, it often passed through the same gate as everything else. And fear had a voice. By week's end, the constable arrived at the tower. He did not accuse. He simply asked Dallin for his ledger, his key, and his post. No hearing was held. No charges filed. The town could not risk uncertainty. The gatekeeper was removed quietly, and the next watch began with a borrowed sentry from the garrison. Dallin did not resist. He left before midday, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle, his step slow, his face unreadable. His departure did not settle the matter. It opened it. In the weeks that followed, the townspeople debated. Some said the removal had been just a necessary precaution. Others said no proof had been offered. Still others claimed to have always suspected something strange in Dallin's manner. A few remembered how he sometimes hummed to himself while watching the road. Odd, they said. Odd in hindsight. And the tower stood empty for a time. Its shuttered windows stayed closed. Its stairs, once worn smooth from nightly rounds, gathered dust. No one hurried to replace him. For a while, they posted a rotating guard of men who disliked the duty and did it poorly. Questions about proper training, loyalty, and wages surfaced, but no one wanted to speak Dallin's name aloud again. In the absence of evidence, suspicion filled the space. And suspicion, once planted, often grew without tending. But what might his days have been like? Imagine Dallin's view each morning. The long, rutted road winding into a low valley, dew steaming from stones, distant carts raising dust in the blue haze of first light. He would know the signs of a merchant's honest fatigue, the alertness of a rider with secrets, the difference between a limping ox and a wagon wheel deliberately slowed. His tools were not weapons but habits. A tilt of the head, a memorized pattern, a word repeated too many times. He had likely denied passage on occasion, but never loudly. Likely passed some without pause, but never carelessly. In a time before passports, his memory was the border. Gatekeepers in history often lived without prestige. They were not rewarded for years of uneventful diligence, but a single misstep, or rumor of one, could undo everything. Their job was to stand between the known and the unknown, and to do so without drawing attention to themselves. It is likely that Dallin never took a bribe. Perhaps he did, but no coin was found. No confession was given. No rival town ever confirmed a breach through his post. His guilt existed only in speculation, and yet that speculation changed the town's rhythm for years. Even after a new keeper was appointed, the gate was watched differently. Traders were asked more questions. Travelers were held longer. The townsfolk looked twice at every face unfamiliar. And Dallin's tower, though cleaned and restocked, retained a quiet unease. If you walk by old gate towers today, some still bear initials carved into the stair rails or stone ledges. Not official records. Only small, scratched symbols left by those who once kept silent watch. Many of their stories are forgotten. Their names erased. But the gates they tended shaped the flow of people, goods, and rumor. Dallin's story was not written down in a court record or sealed in a book. It lived in glances, in pauses, in the way suspicion settled like dust on stone. And sometimes, that's all history needs to remember. The midwife blamed when no cry came from the cradle. Imagine a narrow chamber lit by the dim glow of a single oil lamp, its flame flickering softly against stone walls as a quiet, laboring breath fills the air. The hearth is low, the linens are warm, and water stands ready by the bed. In this room, the midwife works, steady, calm, practiced. Her presence is as constant as the rising moon, as familiar as the rhythm of life itself. For decades, her hands brought comfort. She had knotted cords and bathed newborns, soothed mothers and mended small tears, guiding both breath and blood with a knowledge passed not through books, but through repetition and memory. In towns like these, a midwife was not just a helper, but a guardian of life's threshold. Between silence and first cry, she stood watch. She had delivered dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children across seasons and years. Rain or frost, day or night, her knock was answered with relief. When her name was called, it was often with gratitude, until one night, in a home not far from the church square, that rhythm broke. The labor had not been unusually long. The mother was young, strong, and there had been no signs of struggle. But when the child arrived, no sound came, no startled wail, no curl of fist or cry, just stillness. She had seen this before. Every midwife had. Even with all care, not every child draws breath. Sometimes the cord coils without warning. Sometimes the lungs do not fill. Sometimes there is no clear reason at all. She did what she could, but it was too late before it had begun. The room was quiet. The mother wept. The father stared at nothing. The midwife washed her hands, tidied the linens, and left before dawn. She walked home in the dark, past familiar doorways, past shutters that would soon open for morning bread. She had done what she always did, her best. But this time, it was not enough. In such towns, stories cling tighter than moss to stone. One child lost, one cradle left empty, was all it took. A woman in the market mentioned that the midwife had arrived later than usual. Another said she seemed tired. Someone claimed the water had been too cool. A passing comment, then a quiet question. Had she said a blessing before beginning? Had she prepared the room as she always did? Someone else swore they saw a blackbird perch on her roof the same week. No one accused her outright. No one stood before the church and declared fault. But no one called for her again. One birth was passed to a younger midwife from a neighboring village. Then another. Then all. No farewell, no confrontation. Just a door not answered when she knocked. A silence returned when she greeted others in the lane. She still kept her room tidy. The basin, the herbs, the warm cloths. For weeks she told herself that surely someone would call. That this would pass, as storms do. But days grew into seasons, and no voice summoned her at night again. She left quietly. No cart, no farewell. Just a bundle wrapped in cloth, and the soft sound of footsteps at dawn. Some said they saw her on the northern road. Others thought she had gone to stay with a cousin in a distant town. A few whispered she had taken the child's death into her soul, and could not bear to remain. None truly knew, but they all remembered her. Even years later, the women who had labored beneath her care would speak of her skill in hushed tones. How steady her hands had been, how quickly she had worked when a child arrived too soon or too long delayed. They remembered the way she had sung to soothe pain, the way her presence had seemed to draw breath back into the room. But still, none called her name again. History rarely records such lives. Midwives did not sign parish records. They owned little. Most were unmarried or widowed, living in small rented rooms with little more than cloth and potions and the weight of memory. Their names were passed from mother to daughter, not written in ink. Yet the imprint they left was deep. In a world without surgeons, without hospitals, midwives bore the risks of childbirth alone. They worked by instinct and practice, navigating bleeding, breech births, and fear, often with no more than herbs and boiling water. They understood rhythms, the pulse of labor, the rise and fall of breath. They were praised when all went well, but held solely to blame when it did not. And though they were essential, they stood always near the edge, between reverence and suspicion. A woman who could coax life might also be accused of stealing it. If she used herbs that soothed pain, was she practicing healing or something darker? If she knew when a child would come, did she know too much? One silence in a cradle could undo decades of trust. And so, the story of this midwife fades not in violence, but in forgetting. No angry mob, no trial, no sentence, just absence. A room left empty, a chair undisturbed, a skill honed over years left behind, unasked for. Today, if you wander the streets of such a town and see an old doorway sealed with ivy, or a shuttered window set low to the ground, you might be looking at the home where she once lived. A place where infants first opened their eyes to the world, and where one, for reasons unknown, never did. There are no monuments to her kind, but if you listen closely, to the quiet rhythm of footsteps on stone, or the wind moving softly through the eaves, you might hear the echo of a lullaby once sung to a newborn, or to one who never cried. And in that echo, the life of a woman once trusted, then forgotten carries on.